Good afternoon, everyone. Hello to our in-person audience and hello to our virtual audience. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event. I am Clementine Starling. I'm the director of the Forward Defense Program within the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the latest installment of Forward Defense's Captains of Industry series, which convenes senior defense executives to explore how their companies can best serve US national security interests while navigating the policies that govern the US industrial base. Today's event, Strengthening the Middle Ground of the Defense Industrial Landscape, features fantastic keynote remarks from John Goodman, CEO of Accenture Federal Services, as well as a fabulous panel with Bill Lynn, Chairman and CEO of Leonardo DRS, and Atlantic Council board member and former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment Ellen III. And the conversation will be moderated by Senior Fellow and Lead of the Arsenals of Democracy work, Steve Grumman. Thank you all for being here today. So what is today's event about? We will discuss the key role that middle ground or middle tier companies play in the US defense industrial base in enabling the United States to remain competitive. The Pentagon's National Defense Industrial Strategy, the NDIS, which came out earlier this year, underlines the imperative of strengthening and modernizing the US defense industrial base ecosystem. It sets forth priorities for maintaining US strategic and operational advantages through a strong, robust, competitive, and agile defense industrial base. Today's US industrial base is shaped a little bit like an hourglass. It has a small number of large, preponderant defense primes and a large number of ubiquitous, smaller companies, but very few companies that straddle that middle ground. In a healthy defense industrial base, those middle ground companies occupy valuable intermediary roles between small businesses and large industry leaders. These companies are not only opportunities for component manufacturers and subsystem integrators, but also powerhouses of innovation themselves. They can serve as conduits for commercial and international products to enter into the Department of Defense's supply chain. So today's panel will get into some of that. We'll discuss the state of today's US industrial base and how public policies and corporate strategies can fortify middle ground companies to enhance US defense capabilities. Convenings on topics such as this are really integral to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. The Center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy and ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for US leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the membership of the next generation of leaders. Consistent with that mission, Forward Defense generates ideas and connects stakeholders in the defense ecosystem to promote an enduring advantage for the United States, its allies and partners. It identifies the defense strategies, capabilities, and resources the United States needs to deter and, if necessary, prevail in future conflict. So before I turn it over to Mr. John Goodman for keynote remarks, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is public and on the record. We encourage our virtual audience to submit their questions via askac.org. That'll pop up throughout the event. Just please identify yourself and your affiliation, and our moderator, Steve, will pose some of those questions to our panelists. And for our in-person audience, please use that microphone over there, line up there to pose your questions. And we really encourage you all to engage with us online on X by following @ACScowcroft and using the hashtag #ForDefense. Without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, and John, over to you.
Thanks, Clementine. Steve asked me to provide some context. I'm an Atlantic Council board member and previously served focusing on industrial issues in the Department of Defense. And as Clem noted, I'm now the CEO of Accenture Federal Services. Well, let me start with the context with the Atlantic Council and really underscore some of the things that Clem said. Since its founding in 1961, the Atlantic Council has focused on advancing and advocating constructive U.S. leadership in the world alongside friends and allies. The challenges facing the United States and its allies now are far greater than any time since the Cold War. The ability to face those challenges requires a strong military capability, and that capability rests in no small measure on the innovation and capacity of the U.S. defense industrial base. The importance of mid-tier or middle ground companies is the focus of today's discussion and is timely indeed. Now, I look back with a certain amount of nostalgia to the time I spent in the department in the 1990s, when I was asked to create the Office of Industrial Affairs, now Industrial Policy. My role was to establish and then establish a team and then do the analysis and recommend policies necessitated by the massive reduction in the acquisitions budget, the topic of the so-called Last Supper. But our attention soon turned to responding to the wave of defense mergers, beginning with Lockheed and Martin Marietta. That process restructured the industry, but by 1988, the shift was so extensive that we became concerned about the growing impact of vertical integration. The Defense Science Board did an excellent study on the topic, and the shift in the department's perspective was seen in the decision to oppose the proposed merger of Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. Reflecting on that time, I would observe that competition policy was a very blunt instrument. It was perhaps appropriate to a period where we had no peer competitor and we were dealing with declining budgets. But with the threats facing us today, the question is no longer how do we deal with declining budgets and what do we stop from happening, but how do we deal with the growing threats from peers and non-state actors? In this context, industrial strategy needs to focus on increasing the speed of innovation and the resilience of production, and therefore it needs to answer the following kinds of questions. What kind of industry structure contributes to these outcomes? How can the government affect a change in that structure? And what are the specific regulatory, policy, or legislative changes that need to be made to realize that outcome? Well, today's panel is uniquely well positioned to address these questions. Now, I know that that is something that everyone introducing a panel always says, but in this case, with Bill and Ellen and Steve, it has the virtue of being true. Bill and Ellen are a member of a very elite club of folks who have served in very senior DoD positions and also in leading roles, CEOs in mid-tier or middle ground companies. Bill, as Clementine noted, is the CEO of Leonardo DRS, was the former Deputy Secretary of Defense. Before that, he served as the head of strategy at the former Raytheon Company and controller of DoD, so he's gone through that cycle on several times. Ellen Lord, former Undersecretary for Acquisition Sustainment, and before that, the CEO of Textron Systems, now a director or advisor to many defense firms and contributor to many important studies about the future strategy and policy for acquisition in the Department of Defense. And moderating our panel is Steve Grunman. As Clementine noted, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, he directs the Arsenals of Democracy project. A business consultant, former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Industrial Affairs and Installations, he is a thought leader on issues arising at the intersection of the Pentagon and industry. And in that regard, I would call your attention to a piece co-authored by Steve and Bill that appeared this morning in Aviation Week on this very topic. So with those comments, I am delighted to turn the discussion over to Steve, Bill, and Ellen, and I look forward to hearing the debate. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, John. All right. I won't belabor the wind-up. Let's start a conversation, the three of us, about strengthening the middle ground of the defense industrial landscape. Let's start off by allowing each of you in turn. We'll start with Ellen to sort of orient the audience to your general perspective on the matter, and maybe if you wanted to build out a couple of the references in your biography that John or Clementine has made, so the audience knows, as it were, where you're coming from on this topic. Ellen, then Bill.
Certainly. Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting an important discussion. I spent the first 33 years of my career at a conglomerate that was a middle-tier company. I spent 11 years in the automotive sector and then 22 years in aerospace and defense. and then very, very unexpectedly transitioned in 2017 into the Pentagon as Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment. Going into the government, I knew that I didn't understand particularly well how it worked, but once I got in, I realized I understood absolutely nothing at all, and that when I was in industry, I'd led my team to waste a lot of time and effort and money sort of going the wrong places. So now, having served in government, I have a modicum of understanding as to how government works and how industry can best focus its time. So now I'm really committed to making sure that we all serve that mission by taking our energy and effort and putting it in the correct places. And I believe we're at a point in time where the threat out there is very significant. We have a need for speed within government. Our economic security, our national security is incredibly intertwined, and most of our innovation is coming from smalls, and the large primes, who are very significant, very important to us, aren't always well equipped to embrace that, and I believe the middle tier companies are. So I think we're going to have a great conversation, and I look forward to chatting with my colleague, Bill Lynn.
All right, Bill, where are you coming from on this topic, if you will, please?
Well, I've had an unfortunately long career now in defense. And unlike Ellen, I'm unable to hold a job, so nothing for 33 years. I started in think tanks in the 80s, largely working on Goldwater and Nichols and defense organization. Then moved to the Hill with Senator Kennedy, and in that period in the 80s was able to see the Cold War defense structure, and then went into the Pentagon with the beginning of the Clinton administration, leading first strategic planning, where I actually participated in not in the meeting, but in the backdrop to the Last Supper, leading planning, provided the material to then Deputy Secretary Bill Perry that caused him to call the meeting. The fact that we weren't going to be able to support the number of helicopter lines and tank lines and so on that we had with the budget that we had, and there needed to be some kind of restructuring of industry. And so I've kind of seen two of these phases. One, I would argue that the changes that the U.S. made during World War II, from a government-run industry structure, government-owned shipyards and so on, to the commercial sector, largely was the foundation on which we won World War II, and then the transition to a post-Cold War era with multiple large companies with defense divisions bringing the best of U.S. industry into defense. Those two transitions succeeded in keeping the U.S. at the forefront of military superiority. And then I think the events around the Last Supper as well largely succeeded. More controversial, but they kept the U.S. at the forefront. It wasn't going to be possible with the budgets that we had to support the same structure, and it led to fewer and more concentrated defense companies. And I think those have been, as I said, successful to this point. But I think what's happened, though, is the middle tier, as Ellen was saying, has largely been evacuated. We have a strong, consolidated tier of large primes, and we have a strong set of smaller businesses engaged in defense. There are many fewer mid-tier companies, and I think, as we argued in that op-ed, that is critical to maintaining the health of this industrial base going forward, as we're facing the need for more agility, more innovation, more competition. I think those things can come from a strengthened mid-tier, and I think we're about to enter a point where we need to pivot again, and I think our goal should be to be as successful as the prior pivots in World War II and the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. I think the history has shown this can be done. And I think we need to do it again.
Yeah, a moment to borrow a line from that op-ed, an inflection point for the structure of the defense industry, which is given impetus by, all right, so what we'll now do is that was quick, but let's build out several of these points. Not quite sufficient. We're going to go a little deeper on each of those. And one of them, if we may, is on the, let's reach all the way up to kind of the military strategic impetus for these things. Underscored perhaps most especially by the war in Ukraine, but not only. The fighting in Gaza has revealed other changes to the military strategic situation. And I just wonder if we'll keep in that pattern, Ellen, and then Bill, are there features in particular of how what militaries need are changing that are part of the impetus to this focus that we're having to do? Well, the general focus on the structure of the defense industry, and then we'll get to why the middle tier, build out the point that Bill was making about why the middle tier plays perhaps arguably a particularly special role in that restructuring. But what's changing in the military strategic realm that is really giving impetus and urgency even to these things?
I think there are two things. One, there's the need for speed. There are emerging technologies, rapidly evolving. We see very adaptive adversaries. So in the Ukraine, for instance, we've seen that commercial technology has been vital, whether it be satellite surveillance in terms of electro-optical or other sensor modalities. What Maxar did there was incredible. The importance of connectivity, using satellite communications, whether it be attritable drones, where we found that quantity has a quality all of its own. So all of a sudden we found that what we have in terms of our typical warfighting systems were important, but they weren't sufficient. And the question is, how does DoD adjust to this new reality of dual-use technology and taking commercially available technology and hardening it, if you will, to be in the fight? And that's really pushed a lot on authorities, frankly, that already exist, that in large part have been translated to policy and implementation guidance. But frankly, we don't have a workforce that has been highly trained nor motivated or rewarded to lean forward and use it. So we're coming to a critical cultural issue from my point of view of how do we demonstrate the leadership to motivate and really reward contracting personnel, acquisition executives, program managers, PEOs, to really lean forward and embrace all of this emerging technology. And how do we kind of have their backs to say it's okay if it doesn't work perfectly, but it's better to get the minimally viable product out there and get those cycles of learning and so forth. So I think that the Ukraine has really shown the urgency to move quickly, and the fact that we have adversaries who are very, very adaptable. So we need to really change what we're doing on almost a daily basis. Our business systems don't always accommodate that, and we have to use what authorities we have to do that. So we've also, I think, seen through Ukraine that our national security, again, is incredibly coupled to our economic security, because all of a sudden a lot of sources of raw materials were cut off, a lot of supply chains were overnight destroyed, and we have to have a very resilient and adaptable defense industrial base and supply chain all the way down to the end item level to deal with that. That means being sole sourced is problematical. Being beholden to a certain geographic region is problematical. And I think it's really opened our eyes to the fact that we have a very uncertain geopolitical situation with issues popping up everywhere, Ukraine, now Gaza, and how do we adapt to that? We have, again, as I call it, this need for speed that we aren't particularly ready to deal with, yet I believe the underpinnings are there to do it. Yet it takes significant leadership, and it also takes a lot of training of the workforce to learn how to not eliminate risk, but how to manage risk.
Okay. We'll come back to about 6 of those points as we keep digging into this agenda. the military strategic situation. Is that a strong impetus to us wanting to talk about, needing to talk about defense industrial change?
Yeah, it is, Steve. And building on what Ellen said, I mean, the structure that we have built is large, relatively slow-moving. It responds extremely well to the needs and requirements of the Department of Defense, but it does it in a very, very structured way, starting with requirements, through development, through low-rate production, through production. For certain systems that we have proved that works extremely well. I mean, the aircraft carriers, the nuclear submarines, the infantry fighting vehicles, all of those systems we have produced absolutely the best in the world, and that, I think, it proves out that kind of structure has worked to this point. For that, it doesn't work as well for software, where the need is, the cycle is measured in months, not years. I used to say, you know, it takes me 2 years to get a budget approved. That's the time it took Steve Jobs to develop the iPhone. You know, the speed that's required now, and as Ellen was saying, is shown in Ukraine, the adaptability of the adversary to what's going on, and even before Ukraine. I mean, remember what happened to us with IEDs? You know, the terrorists used IEDs in a very flexible and innovative way, and it was very difficult. DoD ultimately did respond with MRAPs and so on, but it took a change in the system. It took a change in the pace at which we introduce innovation. I also think a second change it's already well underway, and the department is responding to it, but the need for commercial technologies. It was, in the past, I think the balance was more that defense was an exporter of technology, developed technology inside the defense industrial complex and then exported it commercially. And that wasn't all of it, but a lot, you know, think GPS, even the internet itself, largely, you know, came out, at least some of it came out of developments at DARPA and other defense agencies. I think that balance has shifted. The artificial intelligence is not largely coming out of the defense industrial base, yet it's critical to the operation of our systems. The kind of technologies that support autonomy, same thing. Some of them are being developed inside the defense industrial base, and some things like hypersonic missiles still are being developed inside. Right. But more and more of those technologies, so defense is now really needs to be a net importer, which means it needs to change the relationship it has with commercial industry. You have to have a much more symbiotic relationship. I think, and that's what the department under a couple of administrations have been trying to do with the Defense Innovation Unit and so on. Right. But I think it's fundamental to the success of the future defense industrial base for us to be able to gain access at speed to commercial innovation.
Let's stick on the infusion of commercial technologies into the defense sector in order to address these emerging, or really at this point manifest, military strategic changes. I associate the Pentagon's attention to that with Ash Carter, what I call, maybe he called his outreach to Silicon Valley, that I think was getting underway but in the latter half of the second term of the Obama administration, kind of 2014-15. You, Madam former Undersecretary, inherited that momentum, and I know you picked up the reins of that, to mix a metaphor, and I wonder if you could talk about that and what either worked or was at least hard about infusing commercial technologies into the defense industrial base to solve these military strategic problems.
Absolutely. Ash obviously did an enormous amount of work, and Frank Kendall behind him, and really building on what Bill said, we have a planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process, the process by which DoD gets money and goes back and forth with Congress to really end up with budgets that is caught up in the paradigm of 60 years ago, whereas Bill said the government in government labs developed most of the key innovations. Fast forward, today that's turned on its its head, and commercial industry is really driving most of the innovation. And we have emerging technologies evolving very quickly. The rate of development is picking up. We have lots of conflicts, as we mentioned earlier, popping up around the globe, and yet we have a system that defines a need and goes through a 3-year process to develop requirements through the JCIDS process, and then build a POM and get everything appropriated, and then actually those funds apportioned out to the right departments. It's a 3-year lag. That is not sufficient where we have these existential threats we have today. So the question is, how do we quickly react in a thoughtful way? And the challenge is we have authorities, we have policies, but we haven't implemented them particularly rapidly. And we have some constraints, if you will, through Congress's constraints on the department. So what I believe we need to do is look at these structural issues we have. And there are a couple I'll mention. First of all, the way that DoD communicates with Congress, given budget submissions through the justification books, is rather archaic, where the military services, the agencies, each have their own way of developing justification books. They are often in flat files that can't be searched, they can't be sorted, and they're all different. So the Department of Defense gives this huge budget request to the Hill, and it takes all kinds of people, all kinds of time to work through it to understand what it is. We need, frankly, to transform that and digitize the business systems in the department in order to meet this need for speed. We talk about digitizing major weapons systems development, and everybody, talks about sandboxes and digital engineering. It is much less, I think, interesting and intriguing to people to talk about, let's take these software systems that are 10, 20, 30 years old and upgrade those so that we have the foundational ability to develop digital justification books, submit those to Congress, have them be searchable, sortable, and just imagine if Congress could mark up in the same document that was submitted and send it back. So this whole communication issue is huge. Yep. We need to deal with that. We also need to make sure that program executive officers and program managers have the ability to react to this emerging technology, particularly in the year of execution. And right now, particularly with all the continuing resolutions we have, where budgets come out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 months late, and then we have 1-year money that expires, and 2-year money and 3-year money that all get shortened. We need to build in some more flexibility there while maintaining congressional oversight. So I think there's a lot of work to be done with bringing reprogramming levels up just to meet inflation. They haven't been changed in the last 20 years, to allow some carryover funding. The Department of Defense is incredibly constrained versus a lot of the other agencies within the federal government in terms of carryover funds and being able to move them around. We also, within the Department of Defense, have to delegate reprogramming authority. One of the administrative kind of practices, if you will, in industry that allows industry to move quickly is a delegation of authority. So you delegate budget authority down to general managers and program managers so that they can move quickly. At the Department of Defense, largely because of congressional oversight and media attention, every time there's a mistake or a failure, if you will, we put lots of Band-Aids on it and make everything much more bureaucratic. We do not delegate that authority down to allow program managers and PEOs to really move quickly. So there are many of these things we need to do to bring commercial technology in,
Yep.
keep commercial companies interested in the Department of Defense, move quickly using middle tier of acquisition, other transaction authorities, a lot of the things that the small groups do, so that we keep these small companies interested in the Department of Defense, where unfortunately we don't have a lot of people with the business acumen to understand that these companies have to meet weekly payrolls and things like that. So very opportunity rich.
Steve, just
Please.
build on one thing Ellen said. I'd synthesize a lot of what she said is that our system has been built over decades. It has zero appetite for risk. That I think underlies a lot of this, and it's everywhere. I mean, you look at Congress. Congress has built, everybody complains about all the process and all the restrictions and all the reports, and what they're getting at is risk. They don't want to see the government waste money. I think we largely succeed at that to as much as you can, but at a great cost. Everything takes an enormous amount of time. We are unwilling to risk failure, and that whole attitude ends up in the department itself, at the leadership, but even worse at the managing level. You're a program manager. You can't afford to have a failed program. You can't afford to waste money. You can't afford to have a failed test.
Right.
Nothing moves fast if you don't have failed tests.
Yep.
Nothing moves fast if you're not willing to take a risk on a technology, move it forward, and see it fail, then move to the next one. That is not a career-enhancing move in the Department of Defense. You don't get promoted doing that. And I think that's an enormous challenge we have is, how do we change the culture, not of just the Department of Defense, but the whole industrial complex, that we're willing to take more risk to get technology in the field faster, to get innovations to the front, to the warfighter in a more expeditious way. But we can't do it at low risk. It won't. There's a direct trade-off between schedule and risk, and we are willing to take long schedules and have low risk. I wouldn't say go all the way in the other direction, but if we don't rebalance that, nothing else will work.
And there's some structural issues that work against that, because Congress takes their oversight responsibility seriously, which they should, looking at being good custodians of the taxpayer dollars. We now have so many discrete budget line items that all the people that are trying to execute these programs are incredibly constrained by the high level of detail in these budget line items, overlaid with the colors of money, whether it be RDT&E, procurement, or O&M. And when things happen, they can't react. And that's where we've got to give them a little wider berth and go from all of these program elements, if you will, to capability elements. Allow that oversight, but allow them in the year of execution to move money around.
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit like if you had a store that's worried about shoplifting, you set up a system so that you search everybody who leaves the store.
Right.
You won't have any shoplifting. You also won't have any customers.
Yeah.
We haven't gone quite that far, but it's still, we search a lot more people than we need to in the store.
It's like a credit card with a very low ability to charge.
I'm going to come back to how at DRS you access commercial technologies and how your company can be a conduit for drawing commercial technology into the business. But I'm hearing a lot of echo of your service on the commission, the PPPS Reform Commission, the Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution System Reform Commission, I think might have been the correct title of it.
Exactly. Well done. Well done. A congressional
Am I wrong? I'm hearing a lot of echo in that.
FY22. Yes, we just put out our final report.
I wanted to put that name to some of these ideas, but also then more precisely ask, what does that commission's report and recommendations, how does it speak to this problem of managing risk differently? Or the problem is managing it the old-fashioned way, or does it?
Well, it has 28 recommendations after 24 months of work with 14 commissioners, backgrounds from the Hill to the building to industry to research, many people with a lot of different roles. We bucketed our challenges in a few areas. One of them is basically communication between DoD and Congress. And that is part of the problem. You have an emerging threat pop up, you have the ability to do something, and frankly, the building doesn't always talk to the Hill often enough, in enough detail, to give them the situational understanding of what's going on and why things need to be moved. That's coupled with very hard to understand budgets, these justification books I talked about. We also talk about program managers and program executive officers getting more ability to move around. But part of what we also talked about is just the budget structure itself. The way it's built, it is very, very difficult to go in and understand all the line items for research, development, test and evaluation, procurement, operations and management, for just say the F-35. You can't sort that way. That's where I said we need these digitized justification books. But we also realize that commercial industry has a lot to offer, and they frankly get worn down trying to understand where to go in the building, how to work with it. That's why I want to give more decision authority to the PMs and PEOs to be able to do things. We also talk about a fundamental reworking of the budget structure itself. Instead of looking at the three colors of money, RDT&E, procurement, O&M, starting to reorganize the budget in a more intuitive way, where you start with a system that you're looking at, like ships. You talk about what military service it's going to go to, then what type of ship it is, then what color of money. So it's basically the PPPE Commission was trying to get at transparency and meeting speed. And the burning platform, if you will, is we have all of this emerging technology that the building has a very hard time harnessing because of this 3-year cycle of defining requirements. And it's basically empowering the people who are executing to get things done while maintaining oversight by Congress. But there's a fear factor, right? There's this fear of doing something wrong, making a mistake, but we know that there will be mistakes. We know there will be things that are wrong, but we all have to buy into managing risk versus just eliminating risk.
I don't want this topic to pass, Bill. I'm going to park the Leonardo DRS question for a second because I don't want to miss the opportunity to hear you out on Congress in respect to these issues, the general agenda that the PPPS Reform Commission has, or this more general problem of risk. Is Congress going to accommodate the imperatives that we're talking about, or is it just too hard?
We kind of have 200 years of experience in the other direction.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to figure out a way to address Congress's concerns. They're not fundamentally going to change what they do and the way they do it. They're not going to go to multi-year budgeting. It's other countries do it, but it's not part of the culture of the appropriations process we've had, and it's in the Constitution. It's unlikely to change. That said, can we get more flexibility in that process, as the commission that Ellen co-chaired talked about? Yes. I think, can we get more authorities? Yes. Right. Are you going to completely turn the system upside down? No. That's not going to happen. And you're not going to undo we haven't really talked about kind of individual congressional interest, but you're not going to undo that either. We have a representative democracy. Congressmen and senators are expected to represent their constituents, including in the appropriations process, and they will. It has led to, sometimes it goes awry, but sometimes it has actually led to better outcomes, and many times it's led to better outcomes from the department. Not all wisdom lies on that side of the Potomac. Congress has views. I mean, the F-117, the stealth fighter, really came out of Congress pushing the department to do things faster and maybe not what they exactly wanted to do. So I think you need to promote those strong attributes of Congress while pushing for more flexibility without changing the fundamental prerogatives of the congressional committees.
You know, one area where there has been a little bit of progress, and we talked about in the commission, and I think we all need to embrace, is the fact that for the most part, today, DoD procures software the same way they procure hardware. And Bill mentioned this earlier. You know, in reality, our major warfighting systems today are hardware enabled, but the hardware is around for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. They're software defined, and that software is being upgraded constantly. If you were constrained, and this is what typically happens today by either using RDT&E or procurement or O&M funding, if you are doing contemporary coding and you're doing DevOps, you are developing and producing and basically sustaining that software on a daily basis. So we need to bifurcate those processes, and we do have an adaptive acquisition framework that allows us to do that. It is not always embraced. So one of the clear areas where we could bring on commercial technology to a larger degree and enable our existing defense industrial base to field capability much more quickly is if we really embraced software and have what we call the software color of money. Right now, there is an authority, BA8, that allows a little bit of a pathfinder to be done there. On the commission, we really echo and amplified how important that is, and that would make a huge difference. There are a few small gains we could make because, as we've seen in Ukraine particularly, the enemy adapts, and we need to move and adapt very, very quickly. If we don't have the ability to do that with software, we're not going to have overmatch.
You bring to mind, I'm going to mention, we published a paper here at the Atlantic Council last year called Game Changers. Well, I think the subtitle is What We Should Be Learning from the War in Ukraine. And one of the most striking of its findings that I read was that in the Ukrainian army, they are putting coders at the company level. There are guys at the company level at the keyboard, fighting the war at the keyboard, just iterating code every day.
Yeah, it's frequency hopping, it's all kinds of things.
All right. Bill, don't presume that everybody in our audience knows Leonardo DRS. Take the opportunity for the benefit of us understanding the points you want to make of explaining Leonardo DRS, and then we're still on the question of how these middle ground companies, which Leonardo DRS I think is an exemplar, can facilitate the access to commercial technology that we think we need.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Leonardo DRS is a pure play defense technology company. We don't really do much service work. We divested those businesses, and we focus on technology. We focus on across a broad range: force protection, electric power and propulsion network, computing, and sensors. Importantly for us and for the department, we're platform agnostic. We are not of the scale. We don't build tanks, planes, ships. We build the sensors, communications that go on it. That's important as you see the budget tighten, and what that, having run the defense budget for a while, when the budget tightens, the first thing that go are platforms. You stretch them out, you build fewer. But what that means is you have to upgrade the legacy platforms, and you need companies, that in that middle tier that we're talking about, that's able to pivot from putting the new stuff on the new platforms to putting the new stuff on the older platforms to upgrade that. And it's that kind of, I think, flexibility, agility, and innovation is what you get out of that mid-tier, as we've talked about as the original impetus for this discussion.
Right. Similar form of the question. If you reflect back, wasn't that long ago, when you were running Textron Systems, a company like you say, a multi-industrial, which had some commercial technologies right inside the company. Was that something which Textron Systems actively was trying to access? Was that part of your mission in the company? Is accessing and drawing commercial technologies into your solutions?
I think think there was a focus on using best commercial practices for defense requirements, whether those be business practices or commercial technology.
Yep.
And there was quite a focus on being efficient with how we did that. And I think that's one of the things that really distinguishes middle tier companies from the major primes. We will always need the major primes. However, the major primes have constructed themselves to reflect the Department of Defense, which means a lot of different layers, a lot of different processes that mimic, again, DoD. What we really need to do at DoD to be able to respond more quickly to the threat is minimize those layers. And I think that's where middle tier, especially with a company like I came from, where you have commercial best practices, we weren't allowed to build that internal structure that translates to high overhead and G&A, overhead and general and administrative costs that give you a wrap rate that makes you expensive. We had a lot of pressure to minimize that, and I think that's one of the really important things about middle tier is they can be efficient in terms of cost and therefore affordability and competitiveness for DoD. They also have the ability to reach down and probably work with a lot more companies because the barriers to entry are not as high. So it's not a good, bad thing. It's an efficiency thing from my point of view. And I believe there's an ability with the middle tiers to react and adapt and very quickly deliver capability, perhaps in a way that the major primes can't do, because what they are really good at doing are these huge systems, whether it be a manned fighter aircraft or an aircraft carrier. It takes a different type of infrastructure to do that.
Right. You use the term platform agnostic to characterize kind of where the orientation of Leonardo DRS is, and let's build that out a little bit. I connect it to, and then you can tell me if I got it right, actually John's reference to the Vertical Integration Task Force, the Defense Science Board, right? Back in the late 90s, when John commissioned that Defense Science Board study. I'm sure maybe the Secretary did at your behest, John. It was the realization that the mergers that ensued from, let's say, the Last Supper, and which were responsive to a real problem at the time, a cost problem, had created what maybe, at least for a time, was an unexpected knock-on effect of allowing these large companies to vertically integrate, foreclose, in the terms of economics, competitors at that next tier, or even below, from having opportunity because they were competing against their customer's own internal source. So I wanted to actually just come back specifically and talk about how being platform agnostic is responsive, to the extent that middle tier companies, middle ground, as I might prefer to call them, companies have that as one of their features, platform agnostic. How is that responsive to what we were saying militaries now need, and acquisition managers, if they can get around their own barriers, will undertake this platform agnostic thing?
Yeah. Well, as you said, it counters somewhat vertical integration. It forces multiple sources of the key technologies, and it pushes the prime and the department down a path of taking best of breed. Rather than just taking one company's products all the way down the chain, you choose the best product at each level of the chain, and therefore you get a best of breed system. It also, I think, it helps. You can't, at the level we've consolidated, it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It is what it is. You only have a certain amount of competition between those 5 or 6 companies, because not all of them are in every sector. So you limit the competition. If you pull the mid-tier in, you can greatly broaden that competition. And I will use a Leonardo DRS example for that. Is when Texas Instruments disposed of its defense sensor business back in the 90s, the government, Raytheon bought it, and the government insisted at that time that there had to be a second source. The choice there was not, Raytheon, I don't think, wanted to see one of the primes get it, frankly. And so they pushed, and the department agreed to send it to a mid-tier, DRS. The result of that has been that for the last 20 years, DRS and Raytheon have been the two top sensor providers for largely the Army in this case. And that we've alternated, I would say, between number 1 and number 2, but it's been a very robust competition that you would not have gotten, I think, if you had just retained this at the top tier. So I think bringing the mid-tier in is, you're not going to be able to deconsolidate, I think, or not in any time, and I'm not even sure that's desirable. What you can do is have that consolidated higher tier and have competition in we can't compete with Raytheon across the board, but in certain sectors we are very strong, and others, Textron, Curtiss-Wright, others are very strong in certain sectors, and that gives you that competition that produces the innovation, the cost competition, the competition on schedule that you need to bring the best products to the warfighter on a timely basis.
I think this brings up a really good point in terms of the fact that major platforms, whether they be ships, aircraft, land vehicles, the hardware stays around for a long time. But we need to have modular architecture for these so that we can swap out sensors, effectors to get best of breed as we move along. And that's where this middle ground is so important to upgrade those. But it also puts a burden, if you will, on DoD to specify the requirements of these major platforms so that all the interface control documents or the APIs are understood, so that that is common knowledge, that is not proprietary technology to a major prime, but the government owns the interfaces so that you can have this healthy competition and bring in new technology and swap out all of these different devices to continue to upgrade the systems.
Okay, we're going to turn right to building out how acquisition management, like that, practices that acquisition managers in the acquisition system can undertake would cultivate a stronger middle ground. But first, I want to remind the audience, or actually I'm not reminding, I'm making known to the audience that we are going to welcome questions from you in just a couple minutes here. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can just queue up at that microphone there. I do have questions from those of you out in the world watching online, and so I have a ready reserve of questions that I will turn to if I don't see someone standing at that mic in just a few minutes. All such questions would be welcome, and still more from those of you who are watching online as well, please. Okay, so there's an example by which, because that's what I want to talk about, how can acquisition management, let's say we've sold them on the idea that a healthy middle ground is good for the ecosystem, all right, is responsive to the many, many challenges that the Pentagon articulated in its National Defense Industrial Strategy. What would we have them to do? So one is make sure that modular open system architecture is the baseline for some of these systems, if that's what you're saying.
Necessary.
Right. What else?
But it's not adequate. I think one of the things that hasn't been done as well in the past as it could be, but we're making progress, is dealing with intellectual property at the beginning of programs to understand what does the government really need to own. They don't need to own everything, but we've got to figure out what companies own up front and what the government's going to own, and make sure that the data generated from these systems can be used by the Department of Defense to use AI, ML, and so forth to get more out of it. But I think we get into a lot of confusion about being able to use cutting-edge technology because industry is worried that the government is going to take government purpose rights and take away the ability to really utilize their intellectual property industry, and I think a lot of contracting agents, contracting officers don't understand intellectual property well enough, so they believe the government needs to own everything. That's changing, but I think that's one of the key areas to focus on to make this work.
If the government owns or at least has government purpose rights to key parts of the IP, they can thereby induce competition.
I think they only need a certain amount, and they don't need to own everything. Most importantly, as you're definitizing a contract, or even better, when you have the request for a proposal, you can outline what industry is going to continue to own and what the government will own. Because again, when we're talking about innovation in small companies, there's a fear factor there that the intellectual property will be subsumed by the government and constrain a business from growing.
Right.
And frankly, we just don't have those open conversations that we need to have.
Okay. What's a hit list of things you wish the acquisition, if to cultivate a strong middle ground, what's a hit list of acquisition management practices or even policies?
I think the most important thing, and it's not just, frankly, for the middle ground, is for the department to have a consistent, predictable, and transparent plan. You're asking, and this administration has been fairly outspoken about asking defense companies to invest. I think it's a reasonable ask, except we are commercial enterprises. You have to get a return on that investment. If you change the direction of your procurements or your investments or your technology abruptly and repeatedly, there's no return on that investment. It becomes a wasted investment. And what that does is build a fear factor in defense industry that, well, I can't go too far on this because I'm not sure the department's going to follow through. They're going to get as far as the development, then they're going to cancel the procurement. And so all the investment I've made there would have been better placed elsewhere, would have been better placed for the department elsewhere as well.
The best proof point of that is munitions and where we are right now, because there wasn't a demand signal that went out to allow the business case to be made for investment, because there was no ROIC, because you didn't know anything more than a year. And here we are now where you can't create capacity and capability overnight. But there are some more multi-years. I think Bill LaPlante's done a pretty good job of trying to push those, but we need many, many more.
But it's multi-years, but it's also, you can't, I mean, I get budgets come and you have to change programs, but you have to recognize there is a cost to that, in that people worry about the government wasting money, and that's fine, that's true as well. But you also are going to cause industry to pull back from investments if they can't predict where the department's going to be in 1, 2, or 3 years with this technology, with this procurement, with this weapon system. And so I think you need to balance a little bit better that need for predictability and transparency against the genuine budget dynamics that are going to cause you to make changes.
I mean, it goes back to this issue of government understanding how industry works. And the fact that, especially if it's a public company, that's one end of the scale. If you want to make a major investment in a new plant, you have to take, usually to the board of directors, a business plan that shows what the return will be over time. If you only have 1 year of demand, there's no way you're ever going to be able to invest, and that's where we are. If you're a small company, you're all in, you do an exercise, you do a demonstration. What happens a lot of the time is DOD says, this is fabulous. We'll be back to you in 8 or 12 months. They're like, I got a payroll, I got a workforce. I'm going to go just be 100% commercial.
I don't see anybody at that microphone, but I do see a question here, or maybe if you'll give me just a second, I can combine a couple of questions. A lot of the questions have to do with Ukraine in particular, and maybe to interpolate a little bit, the degree to which middle ground companies have been specifically responsive to what's needed in Ukraine, either in munitions or in systems. It's the best I can make of combining some things here. Any particular examples, Bill, that you might cite?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things Ukraine is showing is the importance of unmanned systems, of autonomous systems, and I think there's a very strong mid-tier set of companies, Aero Environment and Kratos and Anduril, that are involved in either the UAVs or the software, or the operating of those. And so I think it has showed the importance of that flexibility, that innovation, that speed to market, is because, as you're saying, if you're doing the code at the front lines, you're going to have to get that equipment there quickly. And I think that's a case where the mid-tier has shown well.
And I think they're embracing risk, right? They're leaning forward and doing some things before everything's totally signed, sealed, and delivered.
Let me now, you're already wearing the hat of an active serving chief executive. You used to. Let's, from that point of view, right? So by the same token that we would like acquisition managers to accommodate a need to cultivate the middle tier, what should management, what should executive, captains of industry, it's the Captains of Industry series after all. What should captains of industries be focused on or be held to account for, if you will, if they're asking acquisition managers to cultivate that middle ground?
You know, I think that it all comes down to communications. And as I learned when I went into government after being in industry, we had wasted an incredible amount of time talking to individuals who we perceived to be decision makers on requirements, who we perceived to be budget decision makers, who in fact were just kind of interested people wanting to learn about what was going on. So I think it's incumbent upon the captains of industry to understand how decisions are made, who the influencers are, and work that. And everything in DC is a campaign. There's no one person that decides anything. So you need to understand in the building, you need to understand on the Hill, and you need to work that. But you also have to articulate the art of the possible. And I think what happens is when industry has great technology, they love to come in and talk about the technology. It's interesting, but it's irrelevant. The question is, how can you apply that technology?
Right.
What is the gap in war-fighting capability that your technology can be applied to solve? So there's a lot of work to be done to, work on articulating things and talk in a language like you're talking to your aunt or uncle at some family function versus coming in with a lot of technological jargon and figure out who the right people are to talk to. Because, having been in the building, we all know there are so many pushes on your time and pulls that it's kind of like being a dentist. You see people every so often, and man, if they don't catch you within the first 3 sentences, you're on to the next thing. So I think it's incumbent upon industry not to assume that everyone understands why their particular technology is so incredibly game-changing. They have to translate it and speak in everyday language to explain that. What's the value proposition? What's the differentiation? What's your ask of DoD to go do next?
Bill, is there a burden or obligation of the captains of this industry in this respect?
I don't think I call it a burden, but I think it's more important in the mid-tier to focus on a few core items. At the larger level, they have more resources. They're across many, many different markets, and they can be successful that way. At the mid-tier level, I think you have to concentrate on a handful. Invest, I think with a handful you can invest at an appropriate level relative to larger companies. I think you can be successful. I don't think you can afford to really let 1,000 flowers bloom. You have to pick your winners. You have to pick them well. It can be an advantage in the market. You can try and target, more cutting-edge technology, growth markets. You don't have to be spread across the whole breadth of the Defense Department. But I think if you don't do that concentration, your danger is that you'll never reach the level of technological sophistication, the level of investment that you really need to succeed in these highly competitive and highly resource dependent areas.
Yeah. focus, in principle at least, and in practice, you're saying, is one of the actual advantages that mid-tier companies can bring to the imperative of innovation, for example.
Advantage and an imperative.
Yeah, right, good. I'm going to draw one more question, and then I'm going to turn to each of you for a closing word before we wrap. There's a question here that I'll let you take wherever you'd like. It asks if you each would discuss the broader economic impacts of a more robust middle ground of companies in the defense industry. And I think, well, they specify, job creation, technology advance. Are there national economic purposes that are maybe not uniquely, but especially well served by middle ground companies?
Absolutely. The defense industrial base is a key driver of the U.S. economy. And I think that middle tier is a great place for employees to be. I'll speak from my own experience. Often, if you're in a larger company, you're a bit siloed where you are, and it's a bit challenging to move around unless you're in an executive leadership program or something. I think the middle tiers give a lot of individuals opportunities to come and work, do a lot of different things. The companies are large enough to matter, but small enough to be agile, and I think that agility is what serves the government well. But they are important because they can be translators between the smalls and the larges, and I think that's a very, very attractive place for people to work, especially if the middle tiers are dual use. You get the best of both, people from the commercial sector as well as federal government sector. So I think the economy is best served, frankly, by letting capitalism play out and survival of the fittest and having companies all the way up through. So trying to constrain everything in terms of vectoring most contracts towards only the primes because it might be perceived as low risk, I think is a bad decision for acquisition professionals.
Yeah.
And I think the middle tier can do an awfully lot, and it's a great place to be an employee.
Actually, before I come to you on this question, we didn't talk so much about the relationship between middle tier and the small companies, but you've alluded to it there. Again, is it different in degree or some other way than the relationship that the larger companies have to the small?
Just from a scale point of view and a pragmatic point of view, the middle tiers are typically quicker to make decisions, whether it be through the legal department or anybody else. So I know I work with companies, I advise companies, I'm on the board of small companies where it takes so long for a prime to make a decision as to whether or not to bring them on board that they have to give it up because they can't wait it out with the dedicated employees. Typically, at the middle tiers, it's a much faster process, and there's more agility there. There's also perhaps not as many levels in the organization, and frankly, the frozen middle tends to eat its young a little bit in terms of, small companies coming in.
Yep.
And I think it's just a little bit more flexible at the middle tiers from my personal experience.
Okay. Add your own thought to that if you want, but sort of the knock-on national economic or other special purposes or effects that
I'm not sure how much of a unique contribution we're contributors to the economy. I think we bring a cultural component that we are in fewer places and larger concentrations of our proportion of our resources, which I think makes those connections to the community more important. The individual smaller communities that we're in, I think we develop, I think, a pride within the companies for who they work for, and particularly for defense companies, why they're working, who the end customer really is, and the importance of that. This isn't really about making money; it's about saving lives, and I think that kind of culture, pushing that's present in larger companies as well, but pushing that further and farther into the country, I think, is one of the roles of mid-tier.
Okay, great. Why don't we resolve on a couple of key priorities that you would want our audience to take away from this conversation, or for that matter, put any other punctuation on it that you might like to do. Why don't we mix it up here and start with Bill, if you're ready.
Yeah, sure. I'll be short. I think the key points to take away is I think the mid-tier is critical. The middle ground, as you call it, Steve, is critical in the health of the industrial base. I think it can enhance the roles of the primes. It can connect the primes to the small business. It can get a fully developed ecostructure for defense. And what is the value of that? I think three things. I think you get more competition. I think you're able to, as I was talking about within the kind of Raytheon Texas Instrument example, you're able to bring competition in sectors that extend beyond just the prime versus prime, and I think that's critical. I think you have more opportunities for innovation, as Ellen is saying. There's less structure, less bureaucratic process. There's more speed and ability to maneuver, which is, as Ukraine is showing, is becoming increasingly important. And that's really the third point. Is I think what you get is a greater agility, a greater ability to move. We were able to, with one system, to move from a PowerPoint presentation to a first prototype in 18 months for the department. That's, as you know, light speed in Department of. I think that comes from that ethos of the middle tier.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. Ellen?
I think the middle tier can be very effective and efficient for a variety of reasons. They often tend to be dual-use companies, and that way you can embrace the technical know-how, the business acumen of individuals who are contributing to the overall organization and for whatever personal beliefs might not want to be a pure defense kind of player. They can play on the other side, and yet we can still draw from their expertise of the overall organization. I think the speed factor is huge. The cost typically the cost basis is lower than for the major primes. So again, being more competitive with wrap rates and so forth. But I think also that the bridge part is very important, as Bill said, being a bridge for the smalls to the major primes, and a place where, frankly, we need to embrace a lot of that innovation and perhaps can incubate that a little bit and provide a channel to the customer. Because frankly, whereas smalls often have a lot of the technology and a lot of the innovation, they cannot afford the business development teams, the government relations teams. Right. They cannot go through the cycles of learning to understand how you really do business with the Department of Defense. I think that the middle tiers can be a channel for them and a coach, if you will, and there's a little bit more flexibility and ability to do that. But I think we need all kinds of diversity in our defense industrial base, from small to middle ground to major primes, and it's unhealthy, as I think Clementine said earlier. It's sort of an hourglass where there's this constriction in the middle. We need to make sure those companies are robust and really contributing. And for instance, we need to make sure that they get their full number of clearances, whether they be facility clearances or individual clearances. We need to make sure for the special access programs that they are not shut out. And I think there's a lot of good work being done at SAPCO right now to open that up to others. And they can be a translation factor very effectively for the small companies to get things done.
Okay. Among the many impetuses for this conversation, I think the key one was the publication of the aforementioned National Defense Industrial Strategy, which the Pentagon issued, I think, in mid-late January. And certainly my read of it, I think anybody's read of it, if you read it carefully enough, is that there's a lot of work, public policy work, industrial work to be done to create a defense industrial sector that is more effectively responsive to what not just I think the U.S. military, but the U.S. and its allies militaries now need. So they know. I don't think that document uses the term inflection point, but I don't think it's that hard to read into it that we are upon an inflection point, and the Pentagon, is expecting industry to adapt. The suggestion is that the Pentagon is going to issue more implementation guidance, both internal to the building, but also perhaps directly to industry about the ways it is expecting these adaptations to be undertaken. This conversation, where I've been building, I hope contributes to that. I do think myself, speaking for myself, that these middle ground companies, the whole of the middle ground between the bigs and the smalls, as we might say, have the opportunity, at worst, just the opportunity to make a special contribution to addressing some of the deficiencies in industrial performance right now that are called out in that document. So that was the purpose of this conversation. I hope the audience found that we met that purpose, and I can't thank enough, first, John Goodman, but also Bill Lynn and Ellen Lord for getting this conversation going and done. Thanks to all of you in the audience, both here and online, for participating. Stay tuned. We will continue the Captains of Industry series on through the year with good conversations like this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve.